So the breakthrough in cybersecurity. In order to start to talk about that, I think we first need to assess if we do even have a problem. What's the problem that we need to solve? And a quick search in Google will help us understand that if any, the problem have gotten worse. Look at the evolution of the attacks. The iconic brands that have been affected by cyber criminals stealing some of their data. In 2017, Equifax. Look at 2019 and the 6 months that we have in 2019. Just yesterday, Twitter announced another breach that affected some of the most influential people in the US, including President Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Elon Musk, among others. The speed of the breaches and the criticality of the data being stolen is evidence that the problem is getting worse. Now, let's not get confused about the previous slide, which is only showing the iconic brands that have been breached. But in 2014, there were more than 700 breaches alone, and that number is only trending up. The number of breaches and the amount of data that's being stolen is an all record high. In order to discuss more about this problem, I have invited a personal friend of me, Lane Bess. Lane is a proven cybersecurity operator. He has been helping to build some of the most transformative cybersecurity companies in our industry, including Palo Alto Networks and Zscaler. He's now a cybersecurity investor, and we're thrilled to have you joining the Illumination Summit. Lane, welcome to the summit.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. On the heels of yet another hack attack against Twitter, so it continues.
Outstanding. Lane, let's get straight to the point. How did we hear here? You've been building cybersecurity. You have been practicing cybersecurity for the last 25 years or so. How did we get here?
Well, I'm going to abbreviate a 25 to 30 year story in a short amount of time here today. But let's face it, when security was first an issue, we could look back to 1993 when Checkpoint began with firewalls. Everybody thought as long as we can protect the network. And at that time, threats and hackers really weren't existing in the true sense of internet cyber attacks. So blocking ports on a network seemed to get the job done. Quickly after that, with so many endpoints being out there, companies like Symantec, McAfee, Trend Micro made their way. But the reality was that the attacks became more sophisticated than the technologies being introduced. And over time, these technologies essentially weren't keeping up with the sophistication and creativity of the hackers, particularly as monetary motivation kicked into play. So essentially, we got to a point where even though there are many, many security technology companies, and I'm proud to say I've been a part of that process, but there are air gaps, and that's the key point here, the air gaps that exist, and those are the areas which get exploited. So that's the simple, short history that takes us to where we are.
All right, thank you for that. And now, where do you see the problem? Clearly, after 25 years of industry evolution, we continue to see breaches, right? Where, in your view, is the problem?
Yeah, let's begin with that word air gap. We've got many technologies deployed within enterprises, and I'm speaking primarily on the enterprise end of things because that's where most of the risk and the financial pain has been felt. With so many technologies and every company having a different infrastructure, your infrastructure is very different, and the technologies, in many cases, tens and tens of technologies, whether it's application protection, whether it's firewalls, whether it's social media protection, proxy capability, secure sign-on, all of these technologies create a very complex environment for even the CIOs and CISOs to manage. And in this complexity become those gaps. And in those gaps become the opportunities to exploit. So the problem exists in the, and I've used this term through my last two companies, the sprawl of technology that exists, and in particular, the gaps. Some companies have tried to develop platforms. You could look at one of my companies, Palo Alto Networks, develop a platform, but these platforms, for the most part, are many different technologies brought together, and all of a sudden, they don't cover all of the gaps. So the problem is over time, the complexity and the air gaps not being filled, even though great technology has been introduced along the way.
Very interesting. Thank you for that insight, Len. Now, I think we have learned from history in the physical world that it's hard to keep the adversary out, right? The Chinese attempt to do that with the big wall. France built the Maginot Line to try to keep the Germans out during World War II. And there are other many examples. Do you think that in the cyber war, we keep the adversary out? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, the answer is no. Now, as a technologist and somebody who likes to invent technology for cyber and invest in companies for technology, you know, there's a wonderful outcome in terms of the potential for companies and building companies. But at the core, it's very bothersome that, quite frankly, the sophistication and intelligence of the hackers is equal, and in some cases even superior, to the technology that's being developed. So the answer is, you know, until we come up, and we'll talk about this maybe in your next question, until we come up with ways to better prevent, we're going to have to deal with the fact that we're not going to be able to keep these adversaries out. It would be ludicrous to believe that we could do it.
So it's delusional to think that we can keep the adversary out. It's a different way to put it, right?
Yes.
Now let's go to the next question.
Yeah.
You know, where do you think we should go from here, right? What's your perspective on this?
Yeah, and you know, a lot of people have asked me, particularly since some of my last two companies have been great public successes, and we see even newer companies having great success in the commercial markets, CrowdStrike, Okta, et cetera. But the answer isn't creating new companies and new technologies. There's two key things that I think we need to see happen here. One of them is a fundamental level of intelligence to be able to predict and create an eventual, if you want to call it vaccination, a predictive, preventative capability far better than what we have today. That's going to require more sophistication in AI modeling, machine learning, and something I'm keenly interested in, deep learning, for being able to get us to a point of prediction and prevention. On the other piece of it, which is why I have interest in my relationship and friendships with you, at Lumu, is this ability to really get to the point of analyzing almost in an autonomous way, testing constantly. And this level of testing, if we can bring it to a point where we continue to monitor these air gaps, whether it's east-west, north-south traffic, whether it's application, whether it's traffic to the cloud or on and off network, remote workers at home, this is where we need to go. And I think it's one of the core beliefs you and the team at Lumu have, which interests me, because autonomous, constant testing, analysis, monitoring is going to have to become a standard requirement across all. Right.
Thank you very much, Lane, for joining us today. Please stay around, because I'm sure the audience is going to have questions to you, and we're going to cover that at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, guys, let me tell you what the bad guys have keep doing all along. You know, they keep completing this cycle. You know, this is something that the industry has named the cyber kill chain. They continue to do so. They go from planning to exfiltration, or from planning to encryption in the cases of ransomware attacks. And the common denominator along this process is that the bad guys have to get access to the network. They have to utilize the network. That's the only way that they can systematically gain success. And that's probably the reason why the past 25 years of cybersecurity industry evolution have been focused in keeping the adversary out. But as we just heard, it's delusional to think that way. Because in a world where attacks can evolve infinitely, at some point, the bad guys will get access to the network. And when that happens, the last resort that we have, the only option that we have, is to identify it with speed and contain the adversary with precision. And that's exactly how Lumu emerges. Lumu emerges as a technology that's simple to implement, where enterprises can, number one, intentionally look for compromises. Just like we intentionally look for vulnerabilities and we find them and patch them, or we intentionally look for problems in defense and we find them and we address them, Lumu encourages enterprises to intentionally look for the adversary within the network. And better yet, doing that in a continuous manner, hence continuous compromise assessment. And the added value that enterprises have for embracing this concept is that now they have the ability to measure the effectiveness of the cybersecurity infrastructure. Clearly, if there is a compromise, that compromise went through the cybersecurity architecture. But now we have the information to feedback that into the cybersecurity architecture to contain the problem, to mitigate the issue. I'm going to talk more about feedback at the end of my session. Now, how we do that? At Lumu, we have built a platform that we call the Illumination Process. It's a patent-pending technology that starts with these 5 elements of network metadata. 5 elements that help us to assess compromise with speed and precision. I'm going to explain each one of these elements and the value behind it. Initially, the DNS queries. Why? Because when a device is compromised, the first thing that device does is to attempt to resolve a domain that belongs to adversarial infrastructure. If that's the case, if you have any of your devices within your network that's attempting to do so, the conclusion is evident. That device has been compromised. It shouldn't behave that way. The next question that you want to answer is what that compromised device is attempting to do in my network. And in order to do so, Lumu ingests net flows. Net flows give us the insights about how a compromised device is attempting to move within the network, what other assets it is trying to reach. If an attack is instrumenting domain resolution, then the only possible way, there's no other, for that attack to contact the external world is if it connects directly with an IP address. If that's the case, then the traces of adversarial contact are going to reside on the access logs of firewall and or proxies. And lastly, the spam box. In a world where 95% of the attacks start with an email, stopping by email is good, but analyzing it is better. Why? Because when you analyze spam bots, you can get to know who and how is trying to attack your organization. And when you correlate that information with these 4 elements of network metadata, you get to know if the bad guys are being successful in its crusade to compromise your organization. Lumu ingests these 5 elements of network metadata from the multiple IT environments that enterprises have today into our cloud where the Illumination Process is running. And customers access their unique level of compromise using a customer portal that we're going to demo later in this session. Now, at this point, I think we have settled that continuous compromise assessment is your strategy. It's how you plan for the long run to continuously win the battle against the adversary. But like in a tennis match, we need to win every point. And in order to make every point to count in our favor, we need to respond with precision. Victoria Zarenka is going to join us later to build that analogy. But before we do that, let me share with you how Lumu helped cybersecurity teams to respond with precision. If you ask any cybersecurity analyst what information I need to defend my organization, to respond with precision to every one of the attacks that we have, the answer will fall amongst these bullets. They need the way the attack is spreading among the network. They want to know how many assets or endpoints have been compromised and exactly where they are. They like to understand how long that attack is going on. What's the adversary objective? Have we seen that attack before and under what circumstances? We call this rich, actionable compromise contest. And we're going to see this in action in the last session of today's summit when Crystal de Villanueva demoed to us how to defend with precision. Let's recap a little bit here. The power of continuous compromise assessment and the value that it adds for enterprises that embrace this concept is, number one, to intentionally and continuously look for compromises. Number two, to operationalize indicator of compromises. Finding threat intelligence nowadays is not a problem. There are a ton of threat intelligence out there. The hard part is to operationalize that threat intelligence in your organization. And in order to do so, you need to combine that threat intelligence with the network metadata that your organization is producing. Lumu simplifies that for you. Third, expand your cybersecurity practices. The one thing that enterprises that have been breached continues to do are vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. In fact, they continue to do so in average between 6 to 18 months until they realize that they have been compromised. What's the one thing they didn't? They didn't look for the adversary within the network. That's the missing link in the cybersecurity framework. Organizations have to continuously look for the adversary within the network. And when they identify that, they can stop that attack, they can contain the damage. And lastly, you can test the cyber defense strategy that you have. But you can test it with factual data about the attacks that are affecting your organization, as opposed to the noise of the industry. That help you to build the strategy that your organizations need. How adversaries are attacking specifically your organization. Where are those air gaps that Lane was talking about? We call it blind spots. Where are the attacks and where are the blind spots where your infrastructure is not covering? And that way you can cover those gaps. My last slide before we go into something more fun, the breakthrough in cybersecurity. I am an electrical engineer by background, and I always have been passionate about how complex system works. And that curiosity take me to dig deeper into control theory. Some of the most complex systems in the world use control theory to execute their job and to execute it well. Now, isn't it funny that in cybersecurity, as complex as it is, it behaves as an open system. We continue to deploy layers of security into our organization, yet we're not measuring the end result. The only reason why we invest in cybersecurity is to avoid being compromised. And that's exactly the one thing that we're not measuring directly. If we somehow can abstract all your cybersecurity defenses, all your firewalls, or your IDS, or your IPS, EDRs, and so on and so forth, as a function of cybersecurity, what comes into that function are the attacks. What comes out is the residual compromise level of your organization, where your cybersecurity architecture wasn't able to stop. Lumu is this gauge that is measuring in real time that residual compromise. But the beauty of having that information is that now I can feedback that into the cybersecurity organization, into the cybersecurity architecture. And the value of doing that is that the whole system now can autonomously find or pursue the ideal state in cybersecurity, which is the state